and a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Dan Shiftan, a friend of many, many years, and one of the top strategic thinker in Israel. And he's going to speak for 45 minutes, nonstop. I'm not going to interrupt him, but I can assure you, none of you is going to be bored. You're going to enjoy every moment of his talk, whether you like what he says or not. He's going to be challenging, and it's going to be really a real treat for you and for me too to listen to him again. So Dan, please begin.
I'd like to put this war and everything that Israel is facing now into a broad historical perspective to understand the fundamental issues beyond the everyday discussions, even when we are speaking at a very dramatic moment when it comes to the confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Let me say that I think that in historic perspective, when historians will look at the Middle East, they will see this war at least as important as the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, perhaps on the level of the war in Ukraine. And in both cases, the war in Ukraine, we have a combination of two elements. On the one hand, there is the enormous suffering that is involved, but on the other hand, what we have is a wake-up call for Western civilization, because I believe that both what is happening in Europe now and what is happening in the Middle East has far more than regional consequences and significance. And let's discuss, first of all, the two global trends that came into fruition in recent affected what we are seeing now in the confrontation between Israel and the radical forces in the Middle East. The first is a technological change. What used to be the prerogative of the superpowers can now be purchased in the supermarket. So radical forces, small radical forces throughout the world, not only in the Middle East, can acquire weapons today that only a decade or two ago could not be acquired unless you are a major power. And now ballistic missiles, accuracy in missiles, cyber warfare, and one day, I fear to say, biological warfare. This is what I'm afraid it will come to, because now it's very easy to develop pathogens in your own kitchen. This makes it possible for very small groups, very radical groups, to hit very strong powers in their most vulnerable place, in their civilian population. And actually, the Arabs pioneered it, but you see it all over the world. The Arabs and other radicals have taken the war out of the traditional battlefield. They realize that Israel has strategic superiority. They realize that they are too small to challenge Israel, even when they're backed by a regional power like Iran, a significant, important regional power like Iran, but they can bypass, to a very large extent, the Israeli army, because they can fire from within their civilian population directly into our civilian population. So the two things that powers could do in the past with radical forces cannot be done anymore. The first is simply to ignore them, to say, okay, here and there, they're a nuisance, but we can ignore them. They are so capable of hitting us in our most vulnerable places that we can't ignore them anymore. And the second thing, you can't obliterate them, because the residual capabilities that they will be left with are such that even the residual capabilities, after you've hit them very hard, can hurt you in a way that you cannot ignore or disregard or obliterate them. So you have to realize that we live in a new world in terms of the challenges that we're facing. At the same time, there is another global development, and these two are not related to Israel or to the Middle East. They go far beyond this region, and therefore we should all take an interest in them. They have a major impact on Western civilization. The second is what happened in Western civilizations, particularly to liberals. After the Second World War, when we defeated Nazism and fascism, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when liberal societies defeated another enemy, we had this feeling that now the world is facing a liberal age. In other words, the liberals are not only successful economically and free politically and have enormous achievements in technology and science and everything. Not only do they provide a good life, but they're also strong. For a while, the United States was the only superpower around. The assumption was that we found the key to be at the same time just and strong, successful and strong, so that we can afford to let others use against us the kind of weapons that before we needed to destroy in order to keep our security. We felt so sure that finally the future is ours, that we can afford not to do what we don't like to do, what we very much don't like to do when we have enemies that threaten us. And we had it all over the world. In Europe, the assumption was you can't have a war anymore in Europe because even Putin, after all, what he wants, we can give him. We have interdependence. Yes, Germany and Europe depends on Russian energy, Russian gas, Russian oil, but Putin depends on European euros and the European economy. So why would he do something that would undermine this interdependence? One side cannot live without the others. You know, for a while, I've been speaking for a long time in Germany, in the rest of Europe, and they called me Mr. Retro because I suggested the Russians could be barbarian, a war can come to Europe, we need to have armies to defend. The Europeans didn't have an army. NATO was all but gone for a while. They didn't realize the need to defend themselves, and the assumption is that since there is no motivation, Putin is just like us. Okay, he speaks Russian. Okay, we don't like what he does domestically, but basically he knows what's good for him. Why would he go to war in the Ukraine? We had in Israel, particularly Shimon Peres, developing a fantasy, a ridiculous fantasy, if you look at it in historical perspective, saying the following: the only way people can have a good life is to have peace and to have democracy. So the Arabs will seek peace and democracy because they want a good life. And if their leaders, their corrupt and autocratic leaders, will not give them peace and democracy, they will depose these leaders, and then we will have peace and democracy in the Middle East. Read his book about the new Middle East. It's a fantasy of the kind that, I don't know, a writer, a great fiction writer should pick up just to write a utopian book. This was the basis for the Oslo agreements in Israel, where we believe that after all there is an interdependence between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So it serves the interests of both sides to cooperate and work together towards peace. In the United States, particularly under Obama, this idea that a strong America is not necessary and you don't need really, even if you know that it's necessary, you're not willing to do anything to continue and support the world order, again, using sometimes the kind of measures that you don't want to use, but you realize you need to use. But if you see, for instance, how Biden treated terrorists like the Houthis in Yemen, these terrorists attacked Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, threatening vital global interests by destroying half the ability of Saudi Arabia to ship its oil to the world, bringing up the price of oil and disrupting the world economy. And Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were fighting against the Houthis. What does Biden do? He removes the Houthis from the terrorist list because you can't give them humanitarian aid if they're on the terrorist list, and he puts a partial embargo on Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in order to prevent them from making war against the Houthis. And the idea was that this will pacify the Houthis. The result was, of course, inevitably, the extreme opposite. They realized the only way to get American support is to be anti-American, to attack American ships, to disrupt the world trade, and basically to starve Egypt. This is the consequence of what they have done in their campaign in the Red Sea. So this whole misperception, and then it is being backed by what you hear in radical universities with progressive and woke people who explain that the world is basically a place where the victims should not be blamed for their victimhood, so they can basically do whatever they want and they can be violent or whatever because the white man is always wrong about everything. This whole approach in Europe, unfortunately also in Israel, in the United States, basically tied the second hand of democracies behind our back. It's okay when pluralistic societies, democracies, tie one hand behind their back if they're very strong in order to protect their values. But when you tie the second hand behind your back, you're basically telling people that you are helpless against them. The barbarians will take advantage of it. And the assumption that you don't have barbarians, you only have underprivileged people who were wronged and are victims, doesn't really work very well when you try to understand Putin in the Ukraine, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or any other radical organization, Daesh, throughout the Middle East. We believed that we can afford not to do what we don't like to do, namely what the United States did by burning Tokyo or burning Berlin, and we can do, even if we have to go to war, only what we can be very good at, having precision-guided munition and only killing the terrorists. And if you kill a few terrorists, then you can rearrange the world. The idea that we are so strong that we can deal with it misunderstood the new balance of power that came from the combination of the bad guys being empowered and the good guys weakening themselves. So it changed the overall balance. It is reflected in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East. This challenge is very broad. What happens when radicals can put their hands on weapons that can hurt civilized societies very, very badly, and they feel immune? They feel that they can do it with impunity because their number one weapon is the reluctance of people in the West to use against them the kind of measures that don't look good when you see them on pictures and on television. So this is the overall problem that our era is facing far beyond the Middle East. Now, here is the interesting paradox when it comes to Western society. We all remember what happened to nationalism in Europe when people took nationalism to its radical extreme, namely saying, our nation is important, but it is the only important thing, and we can crush everybody else and impose ourselves that attitude that we've seen in Nazi Germany. So the number one enemy of healthy nationalism, and you can't have human rights and democracy without nationalism. You can't have it without a frame of solidarity where you're willing to give up your privileges for others because you believe in the final analysis you will be better off if the weaker parts of your society will be better off. So if you have nationalism threatened in the middle of the 20th century, it is by too much nationalism called fascism. And what we're having now is liberalism threatened by radical progressivism, basically liberalism threatened by so much liberalism that it undermines the ability of liberals to defend themselves. perhaps the most brilliant quotation I've ever heard in politics is, "Power corrupts, weakness corrupts absolutely." Very few people would guess that it was Adlai Stevenson who said it. Lack of power corrupts absolutely. Standing Lord Acton on his head, lack of power corrupts absolutely. And radical progressives have deprived liberalism of the power to defend itself by glorifying everybody who fights against Western civilization. And I don't think it is an accident that radical students in American universities, when they go out and burn Israeli flags, they also burn American flags and desecrate national statues and symbols throughout Europe, the United States, and other democratic states. Because this radical approach, radical progressivism, deprives liberalism of the ability to defend itself. Let's go to the Middle East and show how everything that I've spoken so far, that I've discussed so far, is reflected in the region. And I would say the following. First of all, objectively, the real struggle in the Middle East is between Iran, that is very strong compared to its weak Arab neighbors, and has very strong hegemonic ambitions to take over the Middle East. So the most important struggle in the region is not Israeli-Arab. It is between Arabs who don't want to be hegemonized by Iran and its radical proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, the Iranian militias in Iraq and in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and every radical Palestinian organization in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, all armed, inspired, financed by Iran. This is the major issue in the region, and also the Israeli war with its radical enemies should be seen in this broader Middle Eastern perspective. We have a problem not only in the region, but far beyond it, of people who cannot cope with the 20th and 21st centuries, don't want to cope. They are medieval in their social and political structures. They failed in finding their place in the modern world. And what they're trying to do now is to use these abilities that I've spoken about before, the technology provided for them, and the inhibitions of Western society to deal with it. This is also reflected in the Middle East because the number two enemy of most Arab countries in the region, alongside Iran, are the Muslim Brothers. For more than 100 years, basically, they want to bring back the Middle East into the medieval set of values that they pursue. And now they have the capability, and what you have is the Muslim Brothers in the Gaza Strip exercising these capabilities to undermine modern societies. And by the way, not just undermine Israel, not just fight Israel, because there is a weakness on the other side in the ability to deal with them, among other things, because Western powers put pressure on Arab regimes not to use the power that they need, not to use the measures that they need in order to prevent a takeover by the Muslim Brothers. Let me remind everybody the position of the United States during the Obama period when the Muslim Brothers took over in Egypt. And Arab countries in this region understand that if Hamas and other radical elements succeed in their war against Israel, they will also undermine the existing regimes in the Arab world and radicalize the whole region. If Hamas is successful, if Hamas is perceived as being able at the same time to kill Jews on such a scale and at the same time have Gaza rebuilt and have a better life, this threatens Egypt from a takeover by the Muslim Brothers, Jordan from a takeover by the Muslim Brothers, Morocco, countries in the Gulf. So what is happening in the region is to a very large extent more important than the direct Israeli confrontation with these radical forces. What did we have in the Gaza Strip? In the Gaza Strip, we had the most fortified position ever in human history, because it was not only fortified by weapons and by military positions and by tunnels and by other physical elements, it was also fortified by the New York Times and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the International Court of Justice and the United Nations, namely everybody who said you cannot defend yourself if there are civilian casualties. So the strategy of Hamas in Gaza was, and still is, when you fire against the Israeli civilian population, bypassing the Israeli army, taking the battle out of the battlefield, taking the war out of the battlefield, of the traditional battlefield, and you fire at the Israeli civilian population from schools and nurseries and mosques and hospitals, the Israelis will have to respond to your weapons that are embedded in these institutions. The Israelis will be manipulated by the people of Hamas to kill the children and to kill the women and to kill the civilian population alongside the terrorists, because they're embedded deep in the civilian population. And then the Americans will stop the war because they cannot watch the suffering of the civilian population. So what you get in American universities, in the media throughout the world, when you have Canada and Britain and Germany have an embargo, a partial embargo on Israel, when even the United States is restricting the kinds of bombs that it gives Israel, is basically a measure of success for this strategy, saying, if we can destroy Israel from within our civilian population, the destruction of Israel will not come from the military action, but from the inability to defend itself, because people will see the civilian casualties and will be deterred by it. So it doesn't matter if per terrorist, Israel is much more successful in preventing civilian casualties than the United States and Britain and everybody else. It only matters that you can have pictures and show numbers, and by the way, Hamas numbers that you take for granted, just to stop Israel from doing what it must do in order to win the war. Because if you say there is immunity everywhere you can embed yourself in the civilian population, then Israel will lose the battle. So what is at stake here, far beyond the Middle East and far beyond the Arab-Israeli issue? It is the question, can a pluralistic, democratic society defend itself from people who are unscrupulous, who don't care about the future of their own children, who never tried to build anything, have never engaged in nation building, have actually only one thing on their mind: how can we kill as many Jews as possible? This is in the Middle East context, but in the broader context, can Western civilization, liberal as it is and should be, defend itself against people who don't share their values and who are willing to use the compunctions and the restrictions that we legitimately and justifiably put on ourselves to the point where these democratic pluralistic societies defend themselves. This is what is at stake far beyond this or that outcome of the war. I suppose that by now, most of you will assume that the picture that I've painted is very pessimistic. It isn't, because the question is not only what is the challenge, but what can we do about this challenge? And when I look at the broader picture, I'm very optimistic. Let me put it this way. The dumb pessimist says things must get better. The smart pessimist says, even if things get worse, I can get stronger faster than things get worse. Namely, the gap between the good guys and the bad guys, the gap between a liberal, pluralistic society and its enemies of the kind that I've here described can be widened if we stick to what we have to do and if we are willing to wait. I would say there are at least 4 or 5 processes that work for Israel. And I think that when this war is over and we pay the cost of this war for a few years, the situation of Israel in the Middle East will be much better. And let me give some of these points so that people will also have the chance of having a much more optimistic perspective. First of all, most Arab states today not only acquiesce at the existence of Israel, but desperately need Israel for their vital interests. They're facing 3 enemies. Iran, that wants to dominate them, to hegemonize them. The Muslim Brothers, who want to destroy them from within, to bring them back into the medieval values that the Muslim Brotherhood supports. And the complete cluelessness of the United States that is wrong about practically everything and is now trying, after they had so much success in bringing democracy to Iraq and women's rights to Afghanistan, are now trying to bring peace to the Palestinians. I think in these 3 cases, the enormous success is equivalent, is very similar. So these are the 3 problems. Israel will fight Iran because it must. Iran seeks the destruction of the state of Israel, and Israel cannot try to appease it as Obama did and Biden tried. So they need Israel because whereas the United States is by far more important, Israel is by far more dependable than the United States when it comes to the struggle against Iran. Number 1. Number 2, Israel is willing to deal with radicals by bombarding them while the Americans try to deal with them by giving them humanitarian aid. And Arab regimes realize that it's much more effective to bombard radical Muslim brothers who make war against Israel than to give them the kind of humanitarian help that the United States wants to shower on them in quantities that are beyond their capacity to absorb it. And third, Arabs have profound mistrust in the American attempt to assume that radicals can be domesticated by treating them well. They don't accept the American attitude, not of all Americans, but of many. There were very important exceptions. Kissinger and Nixon were very important exceptions about American misperception of the Middle East. They understood the Middle East well, and the reason that we don't have an all-out war in the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs is that Johnson and Nixon and Kissinger did the right thing in their time and understood the region very, very well. But today, there is a mistrust in America because of the profound misunderstanding. The Americans are almost always wrong when it comes to dealing with radicals, and the Arabs are very much aware of them. This works for Israel. The second thing that works for Israel is that radical progressivism more or less exhausted itself. It was exposed. The ridiculous nature of it was exposed. And I think it is the beginning of the end of the very strong hold that radical progressives had over liberals. The problem was not that the radical progressives were many, it was that reasonable liberals of the kind that I want to see in Israel and everywhere were too much influenced by the ideas of progressivism that took them to a point that undermined their ability to defend themselves. In Europe, after the war in Ukraine, some people are barbarians. Not everybody is like everybody else, and everybody can get along based on interdependence and what they call the world community, the international community. There is a much better understanding today that they need to have a strong NATO, that they need to build strong armies, that sometimes you have to go to war, that not everything can be achieved by diplomacy and soft measures. Yes, soft measures can be very effective, provided there is a hard measure available that you can resort to if the soft measures don't produce what they produce. So this idea, you only give the radicals a better life, and then they will stop being radicals. This stupid idea that explains Israel's intelligence failure in the Gaza Strip and explains the failure to expect what the Russians did in Ukraine is now much less prevalent in Europe. The Europeans have also learned that the kind of immigration, bringing in people who don't want to assimilate and want to bring the cultures that destroy their own countries into Europe, this is something that the Europeans indulged in the middle of the previous decade and had catastrophic results. And now you see Europe awakening. You see it in Sweden, in Denmark, in France, in Italy, in Poland, in Germany. You see the understanding that you can't go very far. And again, many of these immigrants and many of the violence that they bring with them is very similar to the violence that Israel is facing from exactly the same kind of people. In the United States, and I think exposing the anti-Americanism of radical progressivism is very helpful. It will take a while, but I think it works in the right direction. And by the way, it's interesting, and let me conclude with this, that in Israel, the progressives have committed electoral suicide. They basically don't exist anymore in the Israeli political system. And the people who at the time had this great belief in the Oslo process are now much more realistic. Look at what is happening in the center left and left of Israel. You have much more realistic approaches than you used to have before. We have a problem on the deep right, but the kind of problems that we had from the deep left are all but gone. Let me sum up this presentation, this initial presentation of mine, by saying the following. Israel is in a tough period, by far not as tough as the 1948 war or the Yom Kippur War, because Israel is immeasurably stronger than ever before. Not only a strong society that manages this war in spite of the fact that we have a dysfunctioning government. You look at the Israeli society, it's amazing. Beyond the disagreement, there is a very deep ability of this society to deal with a very difficult situation. The society is strong, the economy can take the difficulties, the military is very strong. We are internationally strong enough to disregard the kind of approach we have just seen a few days ago, the anti-Israeli approach of the United Nations. We can totally reject the kind of ridiculous advice we get from most countries in the world and pressure we get from most countries in the world. We can simply disregard it. We can insist on what we believe is important, even if the Americans don't understand it. For instance, we had this idea, if you will go to Rafah, it will be a catastrophe, and what will happen? There are 1.3 million people there, and there will be a slaughter. Every prediction proved to be wrong. Let me sum up where Israel stands today. We are having a difficult time. We are facing situations that have no solutions. In the Gaza Strip, unfortunately, we cannot find anybody who will replace the existing Hamas reality by a benevolent Palestinian authority or any other Arab or any other authority that will be benign vis-a-vis Israel and can get the support of the local population. It is not available. We will have a hostile and violent Gaza for a long time to come, and we will have to come into Gaza again and again every time they build another capability to undermine Israel. We will not wait for them to exercise it. We will prevent it. We will take a preventive action in Gaza. We don't have a solution for the West Bank because at the time we don't have any Palestinian authority that is responsible and can take over. I would be delighted if we had somebody to get rid of the majority of the West Bank and have a peaceful relations with the Palestinian entity. It's not in the cards. It's not available. The Palestinians are committed to a political culture that rejects any kind of nation building alongside Israel. They want to undermine Israel, to continue to undermine Israel. The violence will persist. They continue to educate their children to glorify people who kill Jews. They continue to have only one kind of role model for their children, which again is somebody who will continue the struggle against Israel. In Lebanon, even whatever happens, you cannot save Lebanon. Lebanon is disintegrating because of domestic realities in Lebanon, confrontation with Israel, and the Shiite community, very strongly supported by Iran, will unfortunately have a lot to say. And again, we're speaking about a very violent reality. So we don't have solutions. I'm not saying we only do the right thing and then in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Lebanon and with the Houthis we will reach an agreement and we will live peacefully ever after. That's not the issue. The question is not, will we live in peace or will we have a continued struggle? We will have a continued struggle, but with a very with a much stronger position of Israel to confront it, because we have demonstrated how costly it is for the radicals to continue their radical attitudes and their war against Israel. So if we look at it in historic perspective, our situation today is much easier than ever in the past, not because the problems are not serious, but because our ability to deal with the problems is much better than ever before in history. Israel is a strong local power. It is not only very strong in the region militarily and economically, but also because it can maneuver between the different Arab parties. It is politically a strong regional power. It cannot be dictated even by the United States when it comes to the essential issues, and certainly not by the United Nations or any International Court of Justice or Europeans or anybody else. So we can continue to defend ourselves, and we have a very good life in Israel. People tend to forget it. Yes, we have a war at the moment, but we have a good life in Israel. And if you look historically, in spite of the challenges like the Yom Kippur War, the situation in Israel is improving every decade beyond what we had before. So if I look at the broad historical confrontation, I think that we will not have to see the writing on the wall. You were tested in the balance and found wanting. We are tested, and we are demonstrating that we can be strong enough to deal with these problems, and perhaps stronger than ever before.
Wow, Dan, this was a masterful presentation of the world balance of power and the dangers that exist, not just in the Middle East, but way beyond the Middle East, and what can and should be done about it. So thank you for that. And I'm particularly delighted that you ended up with a at least somewhat optimistic view about Israel and about the West, and if the right measures can be taken. But my first question to you is, many people are extremely concerned about Israel's domestic situation for several reasons. Number one, the government and the extremist element that are very powerful in the government. And you mentioned very briefly that while the government is problematic, but the people are strong, which is, of course, a very important element. But still, when you see all those massive demonstrations against the government, you see deep distrust by the people of the government. And then, of course, the issue of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, and that's also a domestic issue that could place Israel in a very bad situation. Already has done it to some extent. So could you please, briefly, because we don't have much time for the Q&A, just relate to Israel's domestic situation? It seems to be very troubling to many people.
First, I very strongly disagree with a very prevalent approach saying that Israel is torn from the inside. I very, very strongly disagree with it. I think it's a shallow perception of what's happening to the Israeli society. Yes, a few tens of thousands of Israelis are constantly demonstrating. They've done so in Balfour. They've done so later, before the war. They're doing it now. It's more or less the same core. Now they've also mobilized the people who are the families of the abductees. But if you look at the society in Israel, I very strongly disagree that it is torn. Yes, you have the most ineffective government that Israel is a part of the government that I find repulsive, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and others. And yes, we have the ultra-Orthodox problem. I will discuss all of them. But if you look at the broader perspective, throughout Western democracies, democracy is in trouble. I mean, look at what is happening in France, in the United States, in Britain. The American society is much more polarized than the Israeli society. The problems that you have in other Western democracies, again, it is to a large extent the product of progressivism. In other words, we went too far, for instance, when it comes to transparency, up to a point where people in government no longer speak to the subject, they speak to the protocol. No longer look for what is good, but for what looks good and sounds good. So we have a problem throughout Western democracies. I don't think that it's an accident that not in one single Western democracy you have an outstanding leader. You have a democratic leader in India, but I'm not sure I want the kind of democracy in India, in Israel. It's a huge achievement in India, but I don't want it in Israel. So there is much more polarization. Again, go to your own country, to the United States, and you will find dramatically, I suggested recently in Congress that the United States should adopt a two-state solution, a democratic state and a Republican state. Now, do we have in Israel fascists? Yes, more or less on the same scale or even smaller scale that we have in Germany, in Sweden, in Denmark, in France, in Italy. Yes, do we have radical right? Yes, it is a response to what the radical left has done and other developments in Western societies. I'm very sorry for it, but here is the good news. There is no real distinction between the overwhelming majority of constructive Israelis who created Israel, defend Israel, finance Israel, and make Israel a success. Namely, everything between Meretz and the Labour Party on the one hand and Likud on the other. They don't disagree on any major issue, and even when they have a disagreement, it's very easy to find a compromise. For instance, on the judicial issue, the president's compromise, the Herzog's compromise, seems to be a reasonable approach that practically everybody can approach. Everybody in Israel agrees that the United States is our ally, that Iran is our enemy, that the Palestinians cannot be trusted and nothing can happen with the Palestinians very soon. Practically everybody. So there is about 80 out of 120 members of Knesset, if you exclude Arab parties, ultra-Orthodox parties, fascists and Messianic Israelis, you still have 80 out of 120 members of Knesset who can form a Zionist government without a major disagreement among them. By the way, I don't have a problem of an Arab who accepts the Jewish state to be a part of such a government, or an ultra-Orthodox who works and serves in the army in such a government, but not the Arab parties as they exist today or the ultra-Orthodox parties. Now, I believe the ultra-Orthodox in Israel have developed a unique way of life that is not Jewish and that is parasitic and that is totally unaccepted. There is nothing Jewish about it. And this needs to be, this way of life, of parasites, of people who don't work and don't serve in the army and even reject the idea of working and serving in the army, and they steal from us hundreds of billions over the years. If we stop financing their parasitic way of life, if you have a government that doesn't depend on the ultra-Orthodox, they will have to go to work. And once they go to work, it will change profoundly their society. And then the question of how much, what they believe in and how they want to express this belief becomes their business, not my business. So is it a major problem?
Dan, I'm sorry, Dan, we are running out of time. So just one more quick question. And that quick question has to do with what happened the last few days in Lebanon, the beepers, the walkie-talkies, all that. People, I'm sure, will want to hear what you think about, because some people say it was a tremendous tactical success, but strategically it doesn't change anything. What's your view about that?
Look, strategically, when people say strategically it doesn't change anything, what they have in mind is a solution. There will be no solution. Anybody who looks in terms of solutions about what is happening has my permission to be depressed for the rest of his life. The only thing that has solutions are crossword puzzles. When it comes to Lebanon, we have to strike a very delicate balance between risking an all-out war without initiating an all-out war. We shouldn't initiate an all-out war because the cost to Israel is prohibitive at the moment, because this also means a confrontation with the United States that, for a very good reason, does not want a regional war to develop, and it can develop from an all-out war with Hezbollah, and Israel doesn't want it, Hezbollah doesn't want it, Iran doesn't want it, the United States doesn't want it. The question is, can it be prevented? On the one hand, we must push Hezbollah north of the border. The kind of arrangement that the Americans are proposing at the moment are worthless. Whatever the Hezbollah agrees, it will break. The question is who can impose it, and nobody else except Israel can impose on Hezbollah something that Hezbollah doesn't want to do. So unfortunately, I think that the ground operation in South Lebanon must be carried out. I wish we will find a way without it. It will be much better. And the challenge is to have a limited war that will hit Hezbollah very harshly and will humiliate Hezbollah. That's more important for the rest of the Arab world than hitting it. It's humiliating them so that it will not become the kind of thing that encourages copycats throughout the Arab world. So we need to strike this very delicate balance between risking a broader war without engaging in it and certainly not initiating it. And this is a challenge we will have to see if we can meet successfully in the North.
Thank you, Dan. This has been amazing. I really very much appreciate what you've done here. And I personally agree with absolutely everything that you have said. Unfortunately, as you know, for the technical reasons, we cannot have the Q&A with you, with the audience and you. So unfortunately, I'm going to be the one who will have to take questions from the audience in the live situation after this record. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words and also for your willingness to take questions based on my provocations. I enjoy it, but I'm not sure you will.
I will too.
Very good. Okay, let me give an overview about what is happening in all the fronts. We have the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Houthis and the militias from Syria and Iraq, and of course, Lebanon, the most important. The most important thing, by far the most important thing, is happening in Lebanon. What we had there is a long period of attrition, and we need to look at 4 different modes of war. Attrition is one, we had it until a week ago. The second is Israeli escalation. We have it since last week. The third is a ground invasion of South Lebanon that we are considering. And the first is an all-out confrontation in Beirut and Tel Aviv that can also escalate to Iran and engulf the whole region. The first phase, for 1 year, we had this attrition. This was very convenient to Hezbollah and very bad for Israel. This is why we are now escalating daily the operations in Lebanon, and we are hitting Hezbollah in a very major way. We are killing hundreds of their commanders and of their fighters. We are destroying on a massive industrial scale their infrastructure, their depots, their launchers, their missiles on a very, very major scale. We are not touching the most important things, namely the heavy, long-range, accurate missiles, mostly buried under Beirut, because we don't want to take the war to Beirut and to an all-out regional war, but everything other than that we are doing. And now time works against Hezbollah. And even though Hezbollah is somewhat escalating, we are escalating much more than he does. And finally, time works against Hezbollah. Now, we may be in a position to reach some kind of pushing Hezbollah 10 kilometers north of the border without a military operations, without an invasion to the south. Probably not. Probably this kind of invasion will have to happen. But everybody wants to avoid the all-out war. Israel wants to avoid it for 2 reasons. A, the centers of population in Israel will be hit very severely. They have so many missiles that we cannot defend ourselves in a way that the casualties will be minimal. This is one reason. The second reason, it will mean a confrontation with a really important interest of the United States to prevent a regional war that will draw America into the region. So we have 2 very good reasons not to go in this direction. Hezbollah doesn't want to turn Beirut into Gaza and destroy what Hezbollah achieved in Lebanon over a long period of time, so they don't want it. The Iranians don't want it because they built the entire infrastructure in Lebanon in order to defend themselves from Israel destroying the nuclear project in Iran, and therefore they don't want to waste it on Gaza or on anything in the north of Israel. And of course, the United States doesn't want it because it doesn't want another failing intervention in the Middle East that will be very costly and completely ineffective. So everybody doesn't want it. Does it mean that it will not happen? No, it will likely not happen, but it could happen because things can get out of control. So what Israel is doing now is we are risking an all-out war, but we are not initiating an all-out war. We don't want it, but there is no way that Israel can not do what it is doing now, because otherwise the people in the north of Israel cannot not go back to their home, and a situation where Israel cannot live alongside its borders is something that will destroy everything Israel is about. If you look at the overall situation in Israel, we've done the right thing in Gaza with some mistakes, but the right thing in Gaza, basically breaking Hamas. We are doing the right thing in Lebanon. The other fronts are just secondary in importance, and the war needs to send a message to the Arab world. You can't do to Israel what you did on the 7th of October, and this is something that not only the Israelis want to send to the radicals in the Arab world, but all the Arab states that are not radical and the United States want to send this message to the radicals. You cannot afford the consequences of your aggression.
Thank you, Dan. This has been extremely helpful and illuminating.